Okay. So obviously, I think we want to acknowledge the situation, and I think everybody is disturbed, like we all are, and feeling very helpless and watching things go out of control. I remember when things happened like that in the 60s. It was Kent State, things like that, and people, and then of course much later when there were all the rioting in Los Angeles and the Bronx, but it feels like a lot of this is deja vu in a very, very frightening way because of the failure of leadership. So we're all in a difficult situation. I was just thinking before we get started, since maybe it's a little bit of fortuitous divine providence, we were studying the issue of diveikut, or connection and so on. And there is, of course, there's a famous passage that first appears in a midrash, a Tannaitic midrash in Deuteronomy, the Sifrei Devarim, which is dealing with the issue. It says, that it speaks about God as an Eish Ochla, as a consuming fire. And then it goes on to talk about Dveikut. And the rabbis ask, how can one cleave to God if God is a consuming fire? And the response there, which then is picked up in the Talmud, of course, is that Mahu Rachum Afatarachum. You have to have Dveikut, or connection with Talmidei Chachamim. You have to find a teacher to connect yourself with. Sometimes it's hard to connect directly with God, but one has to try to find a connection with humans who have the right focus. And since we're also, let me just let Timna in. So since we're also talking about the Hasidic material, hi there, Timna. So the Maggid of Mezrich actually has a very interesting comment on this issue, where it says that you can't have immediate contact with God. You have to find a person that you trust, a Talmid Chacham, who can overcome that barrier. And then, of course, the rabbis say, Ma'ahu Rachum, just as God is compassionate, you should be compassionate. The part of the learning is to imitate the issues of compassion. And the Maggid of Mezrich has a very old teaching, noting that the letters of the word Rachum, switched around, is Chomer. And he indicates that the first task is to have mercy for the physicality, for people's bodies, for people's natural state. And only when the Ma, this issue, which he calls the Ma, is the Ma of compassion, is able to direct its attention to the Chomer, to the needs of people in their physicality, does God descend in an act of tzimtzum to also try to be present. But it's a very prescient and interesting comment that the first move of God's act of compassion has to take place through the human act of focusing on the Chomer, on the physical limitations of body and need, and only then does the issue of Rachum, of compassion, they come together. But it's a question of thinking about that. So right now we're watching with very sorrowful eyes and mourning about this absolutely horrendous series of 3 deaths, and maybe that's part of the charge of this integration of Chomer and Rachum, and keeping the question of Ma, of the whatness, the facticity of human life very much there, so that one asks the what without asking the blaming question. What can be done and not just the blame. So 2 more, okay. So with that as hi Gila, hi Rob. So with that, I was just telling people a little teaching of the Maggid of Mezrich that really bears on the present political situation, which is in need of great compassion, so that the physical eye has to be turned towards the Ma question. The physical eye is the first place where Tzimtzum has to take place, that contraction. So let us, with that said, what I want to do today is to begin to go over some of the phenomenology or the sense of what Dveikut is. Obviously, we've begun to see that it's such a broad spectrum and such a large range of issues, and it varies teacher by teacher and circumstance by circumstance. But I do want to go over that, and then I want to look at I want to give some variety of texts, look at two quick portions that Green gives towards the end of volume 2. And then I want to read also a section from one of the very early students of the Maggid, even much more radical. Then we'll take our break and then we'll study that Mo'orei Naim text. Let me just at least put on the table. So I've heard at least from two people in different ways about the problematic of identifying with certain difficulties and certain questions in some of the religious sources, if one is not necessarily intimate with these sources, how one can learn from that. So I want, in the back of my mind, I want to try to begin addressing that, how a person as an outsider can be coming towards that material, and how one can at least begin to make some small steps to make this material living Torah in some ways. So one of the things that we definitely have to say about Dveikut, the word as an abstract noun, of course, it doesn't appear as an abstract noun in biblical Hebrew or even in early rabbinic Hebrew. It's always a verb. It's always the active verb of connection or bonding or linking, or as Sholem describes it, as a kind of communion, but it's much more concretely related. It's a spiritual reality that arises out of a sense of yearning. Dveikut comes out of yearning. And that very much bears on the larger question that from the book of Deuteronomy, when it says you do the various commandments and you seek out God, then it says v'dav kabo, you cleave to God. Some like Ibn Ezra see this as a promise, something to be anticipated, something that is not yet. You know, the question is, where does Dveikut stand on the spiritual scale? Whereas a person, the Ramban, actually speaking at on a different passage in the book from the book of Leviticus, actually speaks about those in the 13th century who were radical ascetics, who divested themselves of all connection to the world, who wanted to live with the world to come already in this world. And he uses the sense, two terms that appear very much in our Hasidic sources. They have a machshava, and they also have this kind of kavanah and dveikut. So there's a mentalization, there's a process of mental thinking, and there's also this form of intentionality. For them, this was a practice already that one would do as early as one could begin to bring one's religious life into focus. Sholem makes the point that one of the, I think Adrian has just arrived from Georgia somewhere. So Sholem makes the point that one of the differences between Dveikut in the Kabbalistic sources and Dveikut that it begins to emerge in the Hasidic sources is that it takes place in the Kabbalistic sources as an endpoint of achievement, whereas there seems to be a sense in the early Hasidic material that the individual can immediately connect with God. At least it's presented as a more popular ideal, and there's a kind of focus on the individual again, and on the fact that it's something that's this worldly. In many cases, even in the Middle Ages, although it was not necessarily an eschatological action, it was what scholars would call personal eschatology. That is to say, the attachment is so that one would have life in the world to come. So in addition to kind of a national historical eschatology, there's a lot of work that's been done on Jewish and Christian and Muslim mysticism about a personal eschatology. That is to say, the end point is to bring you to a state of life in the world to come, a kind of final cleaving with God. What also needs to be brought in mind, as we're going to just initially say a few words, is whether this relates to the vita activa or the vita contemplativa. In other words, is this something that one does in and through other ritual processes, that the devekut comes through the performance of the mitzvot, of the commandments? We'll talk about how that would be understood. Or the devekut comes through the process of prayer. Or the devekut comes through the process of study, right? In all of these cases, there would be an attempt to focus on the influx of the divine reality in the letters or the mitzvot, because the commandments, in fact, were the letters of the Torah that would be filled with the vitality or the lights of God, and the study of those words or the enactment in the body would be a place in which that would be activated. So the question is, would this simply be done as a form of enactment, as a higher degree of focusing when one is studying, or does it interfere with study? Is it a higher degree of prayer, or does it interfere with prayer? If one reads some of the text that we'll see with the Maggid, it's very hard to focus on petitionary prayer or even prayers of praise if the task is to isolate the letters from their verbal or semantic context and to focus on them as points of immanence of the divine reality that one is trying to connect with and then raise them up in consciousness. So there can be places where the active fulfillment of what the rabbis called mitzvot aseh, the active performance of commandments, could interfere, be interfered with by the act of contemplation. And of course, this was a bone of great contention with the mitnagdim, or the opponents of the Hasidim, but it's also a matter of great struggle for the Hasidim themselves, whether how one would move up the scale of the fulfillment of a commandment of study or prayer or the mitzvah, and then move to another level, or are they replaceable and distinct? So the contemplative life is part of these three aspects of commandments, prayer, and study. But there are also, of course, other types of more isolated forms of devekut that we will talk about beginning in the 16th century, where people would put themselves in a special place, a kind of a hermitage or a cave or a hut with flowers and good smelling things and so on, and go into a state of contemplative withdrawal, a type of hitbodedut, a kind of interiorization of the self. So we want to raise those questions. What is the hierarchy of this? Do you come to God immediately through devekut, to attach yourself immediately to God by connecting to commandments, or is this a long, slow process? So as I indicated, there's this powerful text in the Ramban gives us two different aspects. In one case, the Ramban, Nachmanides in the 13th century, speaks about people trying to achieve this in the world, to achieve something in the world to come. But he also introduces something else that I just want to bring to your attention. It's this kind of two-tiered spiritual mentality. And he talks about this in his discussion in chapter 10 of Deuteronomy. That is to say that one could achieve a certain level of cognitive connection with God and still go about doing their daily behaviors. Now, it was an attempt to try to resolve this great tension between, are you simply connecting to God as a spiritual ideal and then isolating yourself from the community or from prayer? Or is it possible to live in a bimodal mentality? And the Ramban emphasizes this, and many Hasidic masters take this on, that their focus, it looks like they're simply engaged in worldly things, but they are then constantly attached to God. So this is a very, very dangerous and difficult task, but it was considered to be one of the highest challenges of the spiritual life, not to withdraw or disregard this world, but actually to be attached to everything. So a lot of that really relates to this larger question that I think that the Maggid of Mezrich brings to the fore, and that is the sense of radical immanence. This radical immanence, when they are saying in early Hasidism, Melo chol haaretz kvodo, that the whole world is filled with God's glory, or litatar panoi mine, there's no place absent from God. They're making a claim that the descent of the divine reality enters the world through the Shekhinah, and the Shekhinah is in fact this world. This worldly reality is that dimension. So when these texts say that one has to imagine that you are a limb or a part of the Shekhinah, what they're really saying is that there is no place in the world which is not a dimension of the exteriorization and the tzimtzum and the contraction of God into the lowest realm of experience. So that everything that one is doing is always already within the divine reality. Then the real question is, what is your mental state? If your mental state is to engage in a kind of inner nullification so that you become totally aware that you are in a state of immanence, totally suffused with the immanent presence of God, then you are immediately allowing for this yichud, or this connection with the upper levels of the divine in the chain of being. Whereas if a person mind wanders, so that's called the machshava zara, if your mind is wandering, or you have some kind of a fantasy when you're praying, or something egotistical comes into your mind, or you take your mind off of something and you're thinking about this worldly things or ego-centered things, then that creates this kind of block and split between this larger sense of divine harmony. And that's why this split is what the Hasidic masters called perud, right? Perud, which means a splitting between the upper levels of the divine that emanate into the world, let us say the masculine dimension of Tiferet, or the Kadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, and the lower level of the Shekhinah, or the Malchut, or the kingship of God that's on earth. So this splitting is always a mental splitting. The human mind is what is creating that blockage. So part of the task of Deveikut is to get your ego or self out of the way through spiritual preparations so that that connection and flows through you or is felt in all the spheres of reality. So I think it's very important not to get caught up in what people have been talking about, this issue of panentheism, that God is in the world, but he's also outside the world. From the point of view of the Hasidic masters, the fullness of God that gradually emanates into human reality, which they describe as tzimtzum, this contraction of all this divine energy, the world that we experience is God, is the reality of God's creativity, right? And that flows through the self, through the mind, through the body, through everything. Then it's a question of whether one can mentally attach to the spiritual core of what one is seeing so that there is no break, the perud, between the upper flow and what one is experiencing in the world, okay? So there is, in fact, the brokenness of the world, but the brokenness of the world is due to human spiritual ineptitude, broken consciousness, ego-centeredness, desire, all the things that split the mind off from this connection. So therefore, the beginning act of teshuvah, of turning, is this self-emptying from ego so that the connection is immediately connected. So one of the radical aspects of Hasidism is that that sense of the fullness can happen immediately, right? Right? So it's this, it's sort of like the whole, that Buddhist thing of whether you have to do the narrow bridge or the broad bridge and whether it happens over a long period of time or a short period of time. There's obviously the long path and the short path. And the short path is that the radical shift in mentality of getting one's ego out of the way, of becoming a servant of God, in a sense, to realize the actuality of immediate presence. In other words, immediate presence is always already there. It's a question for the natural eye to be able to see it with a spiritual eye, to be able to access that immediate vitality. That's precisely why the Baal Shem Tov gave one of his most radical teachings exactly in that same passage, around that same passage in Deuteronomy, which was talking about to do the commandments and then cleave to God. Already in Deuteronomy 11, you have the phrase, Visartem ve'avadatem, that if you turn aside, you will be destroyed. And the Baal Shem Tov says, the turning aside is this mental lapse. The turning aside is seeing the world only in terms of its physical externality, in terms of its distinctiveness, in terms of its separateness, like it's the same separateness that we introduce to the world through our normal form of mentality. And as soon as you do that, you're lost, the avadatem. You're lost because you have turned into an idolater. That's how the radical way that the Baal Shem is talking about this. Let me say it slightly differently. He's saying that the ideal is to transform the ani, the I, right? And so the Hebrew, just think of the letters A-N-I. If you think about it in the English, the ani is the I, which is that lowest level of human consciousness in the world of Shekhinah, or this worldly reality, and to reconfigure that in consciousness to turn the ani, the I, A-N-I, into ayin, or A-I-N, into the nothingness. That is the process of deveikut, in which there is a self-abstraction of ego-centeredness, so that the mind is constantly attached or connected to God. That's the first level of what deveikut is. It's that immediate attachment. And then radical immanence implies a monotheism. The mind is what creates polytheism, right? The mind is what creates the multiplicity of gods, or let's say the multiplicities of reality, so that you see things as things and not as part of the divine reality. So that's why he says one has to be in this tamid, this constant, intense case. So that's why the paradox is he speaking just to a common person, or to the, one second, Josh, or to the elite? He speaks in the language of the common person, but obviously this is an enormously absorbing psychological issue, to be constantly seeing the inwardness of things of the divine reality. But the truth of what he's saying that we can absorb, even if we're on the outside of this, is that the shift of mind, the shift in which you only see the external phenomena, is to get trapped into your own cognitive silos. And that trap is what produces a form of this issue of klipot, or the fragments, or the shells. In other words, the shells are what we'd call the multiple silos of consciousness, where everything is simply separate from one thing and another. And if you were to give divinity to this, if you'd say these things have their own independent power, you become a polytheist in a certain sense, right? So he's saying, visartem, if your eye moves, because there are many other texts that deal with that, of making your eye focus but not letting your eye wander. There's a very much focus on the spiritual eye as opposed to the natural eye. But if the eye wanders, then ve'avadatem, you are spiritually doomed, because you've lost that connectivity. And then one has to then regroup through all kinds of spiritual activities. So that's the paradox. There's the melochal haaretz kavodo. The whole world is filled with God's glory from these masters' point of view, and that's the mystery of tzimtzum. From their point of view, tzimtzum is not a Lurianic break and crisis, but tzimtzum is the gift of God to bring divine potentiality into the level of our ordinary mind and experience, right? But it's precisely because it has been lowered to the level of our level of experience that we may only see the externality of the person or the flower or the tree, and not focus on the spiritual vitality, which is part of its unifying force. And that's what creates this sense of yichud, of connectivity back to that larger source. So Josh, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify a clarification on terms. Is there a difference between describing the orientation towards immanence as monotheism or monism? Like, why is it monotheism, and what is the theism aspect?
All right, so maybe these terms are terms external to the Jewish mystical experience. They're terms, the descriptive terms of contemporary scholars who are trying to categorize types of reality. So you could say that from the point of the beginning of the emanation, everything in the world is connected, right? It's a great chain of being. That is a monistic totality, right? And theoretically, that monistic totality would all the way go back to Ein Sof, even though that infinity of possibilities is undifferentiated. But our consciousness is aware of the gradual differentiation of levels of reality and consciousness, okay? So you could say that the difference between the upper divine reality or the Ein Sof is transcendent and other, but there's a danger of how you parse the word other, right? And there's a great concern. What is the nature of the other? There is the other that can produce a polytheistic consciousness, and there's an other that produces this cognizance that everything is one, right? So a religion like Judaism is operating at multiple levels. When a person is simply performing the normal commandments or prayer, there is a personified focus towards God as the one who hears prayer or receives prayer or responds to human language or action, okay? But when one and from that point of view, there is other as difference, right? Other as difference. But if one is then in a more contemplative state of consciousness, the other is oneself, right? And there is no gap, right? So there's always a very delicate line between these two, okay? So that's why I'm not, I think it's sometimes helpful to use monism, pantheism, theism, and they help us at least get some sense of what we're talking about. But the mystical mind can move through these things in a more fluid manner.
Yeah, so to build on top of that, do you think that, I mean, you were kind of mentioning this, or earlier you were talking about how the life of commandments, the vita activa, can interfere with the contemplative life.
Right.
Do you think that the sort of scholarly outside perspective, looking at Judaism and calling it like monotheism and putting that term on it, despite that being not part of like the Jewish mystical reality, do you think, I mean, to what extent is that like a positive and or a block, you know, like it has both?
So look, that's a much larger question, but let me at least put it in, let me just at least sharpen the problem, okay? And I'll sharpen the problem precisely in the way there was always a pushback against the mystical dimension, even within Hasidism, all right? So if you start with the assumption that the world is tov, the world is good, right, from Genesis 1, what would be the purpose of this spiritual nullification to bring the world back to God, to go from the isness of the yesh back to God? Is that truly a nullification of the world, or is it another mode of acknowledgement of the goodness of the totality, right? If the task is to be actively involved in performing the commandments, what would be the purpose of this kind of inner space of what the Hasidic sources talk about, menucha, an inner silence in which one is, in a sense, not acting. It's being done through a mentalization, right? And if the goal of prayer is to articulate one's creatureliness, what would be the purpose of a prayer in which one nullifies language so that language is restored to its divine root? So obviously, the different masters try to struggle with the exoteric side of Judaism, its public commandments, public actions, public needs, public prayer, right? And the interior side. And that's always going to be a delicate balance. And it's precisely because that dividing point is so permeable that you can't always express it to the newcomer. That's why you wouldn't initiate a person who didn't have a certain background into this, because they would trivialize and polarize the issue, or they would not see that certain language should be understood more metaphorically so that one could be more permeably moving from the concrete to the spiritual. So there's a great need in esoteric systems to train a person to come to these things over a long period of time. And that was also one of the criticisms of early Hasidism, even within itself. Namely, they felt that the beginning of the secular world and enlightenment and everything was producing such a crisis for the spiritual world that they said, using the old phrase from the Talmud and the Psalms, "Eit lasot." One has to act now and save the law because people heferu toratecha. People are overturning the law. So they immediately made the esoteric exoteric, even if the common person could never understand that. But so there's always that phrase appears in the 13th century. Maimonides uses that phrase because he was afraid that because of the perplexity of the meaning of anthropomorphisms, people would disregard. The Zohar uses that. It becomes a tension in the 18th and 19th century. And it's always this question of how do you initiate a person into a system that has an inner and outer side, an inner and outer side of action, an inner and outer side of mentality, an inner and outer side of language, that the words mean, but the words are also filters for something else, right? So part of the perplexity in this material is also that it's being presented not just by these elite spiritual virtuosi like the Maggid of Mezrich, but they're also speaking to the common person. And they may be misunderstanding or distorting it, or they can't do it and they simply join in groups and sit around the table, right? So it's a very serious problem. The other issue would be relating to study. We're going to come to this in one more second. Namely, the issue, just to give you one of the ways in which the very language of Rabbinic Judaism could be turned inside out for the spiritual process, is one of the ideals of Torah study is called Torah Lishma, Torah for its own sake, okay? That is to say, you're not learning Torah for, even as a rabbinic ideal of Talmudism, you're not learning Torah to necessarily to receive a reward. You're not learning Torah for any, as a means, that it should only be an end, okay? So that's this ideal Torah Lishma, right? So how did the Hasidic masters try to deal with that? They did it in two very interesting ways. Torah Lishma could be understood as Torah Lishma, for its name. That is to say, the name of God, which is the ultimate signifier in the Torah. Because the Torah is made up of multiple letters, but ultimately these are simply algorithmic forms of the tetragram, the Yud, He, Vav, He, right? And that all the letters are simply variants in an algorithmic variation for the sake of our comprehension of the divine name. So that you'd be studying Torah to make contact with God, to God's name, that is now reformulated in the multiple language of normal discourse. Abraham went to Haran, Abraham went down to Egypt, right? Those are aspects of a divine reality, but is making you think about that in ordinary speech and discourse. Another way that the Hasidic masters would try to kind of reposition, so that would mean that when you're studying, you're not only reading the text, but you're doing it for the sake of that name. So you want to be meditating on the divine name. Or that every letter of every word is an algorithmic expression of the four-letter divine name. So that you're reading but not reading, right? You're reading but trying to understand the spiritual energy of every letter and trying to understand how the letters are connecting. And in a certain sense, by connecting the letters and the descriptions of the world, you are in fact experiencing the mystery of the divine name that is expressed through the multiplicity of our worldly experience, right? In other words, you are entering into a meditative encounter with our experiential world that we talk about, but you're focusing on that divine name or the divine energy that is interior to it. Now, an even more radical aspect of that form of meditative study, where you would study, but you're now focusing on God as the central act, is lishma was understood for the sake of, for the shame of the hay. Lishma, for the sake of the shame of the hay. And the hay refers to the Shekhinah, that is the immanent reality of all being. So you are studying to try to bring consciousness of the divine reality that fills the Torah in the deepest spiritual sense, and make contact with the reality that our living Torah is a divine dimension connected to much higher spiritual worlds that are very different, where the letters are simply potencies and possibilities. But we're now seeing them as actual letters and forms. Okay, so that would be, and the same would go for the performance of the commandments, right? Since the commandments are initially verbalizations in the Torah, you could, and even, for example, even the sacrifices, if you meditate on the letters and their words, you are connecting with the divine energies within the letters and actualizing them in a kind of mythic mental sense, right? And connecting them back to God, right? So that, and then all the more so that if one is reading the commandments, like you should do X, and then you actually actualize that in your body, and it's done with the same mental diveikut or connection that it's coming out of the spiritual energy of the words that you are now bringing into your body, you are now enacting a meditative action, right? The meditative action of study then becomes internalized into the body as a configuration of speech that now activates human behavior. And in a sense, from the Hasidic point of view, that if you're doing that with true spiritual consciousness, not self-consciousness, it's the divine that's acting through you, right? That you are allowing the tasks of the world to be the full expression of the Shekhinah, of which you are simply a humanoid agent, right? Now that could be understood in a very deep and powerful sense of Dveikut, or it could be trivialized in any number of ways, and the opponents of Hasidism read it in the most trivializing of forms, right? But you can see that from another point of view, it has a very, very profound spiritual way in which everything in the world is the speech of God. Now, that's because we read it and we understand it. That's part of why that the world of speech is the world of the Shekhinah, that everything that is read and studied can be an actualization of the divine in smaller verbal pieces, right? And that helps one to focus on that divine core within it. So Hasidism, because the sages were at least extraordinarily learned in the Talmudic tradition, they're struggling to keep these multiple realities together. It was obviously more difficult for an illiterate person or people who had to work and couldn't study. In many cases, they would attach themselves to a tzaddik, or they would support Talmud study so that they would get the merit indirectly, even though they couldn't have that merit in a more direct manner. Okay, so these are kinds of types of issues that. But I just want to, before we now take a look at one of the texts, I just want to re-emphasize this issue of the radical immanence that is being described here, right? And we began a couple of weeks back about talking about Tzimtzum. There's the grades and the contractions of divine reality that become more and more actual, and they become more recognizable in terms of the world of our mental and physical experience, right? That is a gift of God that even within the shells of experience is part of allowing God's godhood to be experienced by human consciousness and human sensation, right? That is a core element of the Hasidic mentality. Part of God's goodness from the point, and that's how the Maggid actually begins all of his teachings, that God wanted it to have the light. It's called the Simcha. God wanted to have the light. It's the old question, why does God create the world? What does God need if God is, etc.? That was the old philosophical question in the Middle Ages. And the answer that's being given here is that God creates the world because otherwise the human being would have no consciousness of God, right? So it's understood to be this act of, the overflow is an act of beneficence. And the beneficence comes down and contracted to our forms of mentalization and sensation, because we're only people. And the things that have been contracted to the Tzimtzum are also things that are sensate, or they have their own mentalities. But once you can connect to the divine truth of the things that you're experiencing and thinking, you're connecting to God, and that was the purpose of the creation, right? The purpose was to be able to lock in at the Dveikut level to the divine, to realize that it's a divine gift, to realize that the inner core of experience is the divine chiyut, or vitality of existence, right? Ultimately, there's only one thing that's coming down from heaven, and that is the vitality of God's creativity, right? In multiple forms. And to lock into that, the core of the vitality, not its outer expression, but to lock through the outer expression, to mentally bind yourself, that's the veikut, to those verbal forms, sensate forms, is immediately to have this consciousness of God. That's why the veikut will be described in some cases as da'at, as a form of consciousness, right? Sometimes it's a form of connection in which one is not aware of oneself. But here we go back to these puzzling things of language. Part of the awareness of oneself is the sense that one's selfhood is God, right? And so it's that double reality. Maybe this would be a time just to remind you of that text that we looked at last week, namely the issue of the trumpet being chatzotzrot, of the two tzurot, the two forms. Remember, we looked at that, and that's a text that reverberates from the Maggid for hundreds of years in numerous forms. It comes in for Rosh Hashanah, for the shofar. It comes in the study of the various texts that are being dealt with. And you remember that text, that the text is that a person who is one, is the one half, one form is the self. But the self that only experiences itself in natural terms is not Adam or person, it's simply Dam. It's simply your natural pulsation of physicality. And only when you realize that the part that makes you into a spiritual person is the other tzura, which is the other side, which is God, that is the Aleph, right? The alpha of the universe. And when those two things come together, remember that was the image of the divine on the throne. One becomes fully a person when one becomes aware that there is no break, and that one becomes aware of one's supernatural self. That is to say, one's self is connected to its divine core. Otherwise, the lower level of consciousness is simply the natural eye, the thing that sees dumb, that sees blood, that sees earthiness, that simply sees the pulsation of things, but doesn't see the divine mystery that's pulsing in that, and that's the Aleph, that's the Alpha, right? That's the part that completes the self and creates that bonding that flows through from one side to the other. Being aware of that is what the mystics are talking about as yichud, connectivity, that connection. That dveikud is that connection. So from my point of view, I don't think it's helpful for us to get involved in the side of whether there was truly unio mystica, namely that the self is absolutely lost in God, or there always remains a distinction, which keeps it theistic. There is a very permeable issue, and this is simply modern language that's trying to deal with that. But achdut, or connection, means that one is bonded in consciousness and aware of it and not aware of it simultaneously. Okay? That is the connection of dveikud. So it's a term that floats with many meanings. Sometimes the word kesher, the likshor, is the verb that's being used, and many other kinds of terms refer to that deep connection. Okay? Anybody want to bring up anything before we take a look at two of the texts of Green that will at least provide, and then I want to look at this very interesting text of the Yosher Divrei Emet, of Meshulam Feibush of Baruch, which is about the most radical of these mental consciousness. And I'll translate a couple of sections. Anybody have any questions so far? I'm not trying to dodge the definitional issues, but what I do want to stress is that when it's lived from the inside, it's not lived as a definition, right? It's lived as a form of spiritual expression. And we're making these categories because we're trying to make typologies and history of religion correlations, and that's very important. I would be the last person to deny the importance. But from the inside, it means something. The religious act is the doing of the action. It's not simply the outer description of it. Okay. Anybody want to bring up anything so far that we've been dealing with? Okay. So these are difficult things, and that's why I want to turn to a number of texts that you can see it in action and see it as it is being taught by a master. Okay. So that how the teacher wants to frame it and how the audience might have heard it if they could have heard it correctly. So let's turn to the first of these. I think it's volume 2. These are texts that you prepared for today. The English is on 132, and the Hebrew is 327. Okay. So I want to do 2 quick texts with you, and then also do something of this text. Let me just see. This is a 327. Yeah. All right. So this is a text from the portion of Nitzavim, which is near the end of the book of Deuteronomy. It's from a collection called Shemen HaTov, which was collections that were brought from Shmuel Shmelka of Nikolsburg, who is one of the people who actually brought people like Levi Yitzchak or Berditchev to meet the Maggid. So he gives us very early teachings of the Baal Shem and very early presentations of that. So I'm going to be, so if you have your English text, if that's the easiest one, on page 132, if you have the English the Hebrew, it's going to be on 327. I'm going to be translating, but we'll see how the word dveikut appears and how it's brought into a context when the word doesn't appear. In other words, what we're always trying to figure out, what is the deep theological ground that they're presupposing, and then how it surfaces into the homily or the teaching. So, so the text begins from Deuteronomy 29. Atem nitzavim hayom kulchem. You are all standing this day before the Lord your God. So now, since the word you're all standing, the issue of standing and movement is going to be the major theme, right? One of the classic issues, because the text is often connected with vayelach, nitzavim vayelach, is that you're standing, but you have to move. Angels only stand, human beings move. So the issue of moving, changing, have variability of consciousness is that. So the question now is you're standing. So that means the Hasidic master, in a classic midrashic style, will now associate to a text elsewhere in scripture where the word standing is going to appear. And that will become the way that he is now going to work out the spiritual problematic that he wants to teach. So he jumps to Exodus 17:6, where it says, behold, I am standing before you this day. This is God speaking, right? I am standing before you this day on the rock in Chorev, and you smote it, and waters came forth, and the people drank, okay? So here you already begin to have this puzzle. God says, I am standing, okay? So the master begins by drawing attention. He says, Kushya Meforsemet. This is a well-known problem. What's the problem? That if what does it mean to say that God is standing in a specific place? What is the force of this radical anthropomorphic statement that God is? Because it says God is Maloch ha'aretz kavodo. If God is the fullness of the world, and we talked about this notion of radical immanence, what would it mean to turn God into some topographic point, to say God is here and not there, right? So he's raising the question, is God other than the world? If God is the fullness of the world, what could it mean to say that God is at a specific point addressing a person in a very specific point in time? And what does it mean if God is Maloch ha'aretz kavodo, he's full of the world, or there's no place absent from God? How, he says, how is it possible for a human being to say that God is standing there, not moving on a place? If God is the fullness, what would it mean to say that God is located and only in one place? Okay, so it's obviously a klutz kasha. It's just trying to irk you so that he can get at a deeper spiritual issue. Right? He knows the answer to this, but he's trying to sharpen this because he wants you to be thinking about what it means to think about fullness. He wants you to think about what does it mean to talk about spiritual standing and spiritual movement. In other words, he's raising a contradiction because he wants now to sharpen the problematic. Right? So what does it mean to say that he's only in this place, that God would be in one place, Chalila, God forbid. Okay. So now he goes into say. So he said the real root of all of this is that and we all know what the sages have taught, that the only real notion of Amidah, of standing, is in prayer. So now he's going to kind of begin to turn this issue about the consciousness in prayer. And of course, the standing prayer called the Amidah is considered the classic prayer. So he says, and they say that the true prayer is the standing prayer. So as it says, Pinchas stood and prayed from Psalm 106. And apparently this can't really be understood because what does it mean to say, can we really say that there's only one, that one only stands before God? Aren't there other ways of relating to God in a prayerful motion? Perhaps they are really saying, Le'eze davar seichel v'lo kefi pashtut hanyan. So now he's saying, since this doesn't make any sense, you have to begin to say, no, this is a matter of inner consciousness. Standing before God, or God standing before you, has nothing to do with one mode, one physical act of disposition before God, or one physical place of God, because now he's already merged two types of standing. No, you have to begin to understand this as a form of a more mental and spiritual issue. Because, but so he said, let's not, obviously the Torah is not going to, wasn't speaking to spiritual simpletons, right? So he's assuming that people are going to realize that and they're not going to get trapped in anthropomorphic language. But it's really speaking to Anashim Shleinim V'yirat Hashem U'v'torato. So now obviously he's saying, he's talking about that first generation, that he's talking about people who are spiritually perfected, they're Shleinim, and they're people who had the fear of God. So he's obviously, from the point of view of this text, it's not, the ordinary person is not being addressed, because they would make all kinds of false anthropomorphic presumptions. But it's addressed to a person who is able to see through that, right? And they would understand that there is a deeper form of prayer and a deeper form of notion that's meant about this issue. Because why? Now look how he takes it. Because they know that they are holchim, they are moving. Their mind is always in flux. That their mind is, all their life, their mind is moving b'sichlam u'v'machshavtam mimadriga lemadriga, me'olam elyon. So he's obviously speaking to spiritual adepts. So he's saying, it can't be that God is in only one place, and it can't be that the human being is only in one place, and it can't be that the issue of prayer means that you're simply standing upright and performing the standing prayer. Because once we make the mental shift that you have to understand, we're talking about a mental spiritual reality. He says, the people he's talking to, that your entire life is a process of different levels of mentalization, he says, right? You're always going from one level or another. You're never static. Sometimes you have a full mind of consciousness. Sometimes you have a small mind, katnut. Sometimes your mind is contracted to petty things when you're in prayer. Sometimes your mind is open and it's gadlut. Your mind is open to much broader spiritual issues. Sometimes you feel closer to God, and sometimes you feel more petty about yourself. So he says your mind is always going from this, and you're going from one world to the other, to another higher world. In other words, to different levels of consciousness. He says, that. And that takes place when a person wants to receive God, right? To receive God means that one's mind is opening and contracting, struggling to receive, struggling with its own nature, constantly thinking about the nature of the image, constantly trying to translate, what am I saying? And what does this mean in terms of my spiritual life? That's what he's talking about. Now, there's always this active struggle to figure out what's going on. Lavoda, to come to the true service, the avoda, to come to a true service of God, and to be davuk etzlo yitbarach, and to be connected to God. So in other words, he's saying that we're not talking about the wandering of the mind, which is machshava zara. That's when the mind wanders against your better intention. Something you're thinking, who didn't speak to me nicely? What my problem? What do I need? And those things sort of interrupt you in prayer or anything like that. You're aware of all your psychological issues when you try to have silence, and all that stuff just floods in. He said, no, that's not the issue right now. He said, I'm trying to talk to you about a person who's trying to get God consciousness. Their whole goal is God consciousness, but that means that they're always alert to whether what their mind is doing. They're not simply doing something by rote. They're not simply locked in to some particular configuration. There he says, so therefore a person has to search day and night, he says, by means of the Torah and the commandments, and by means of tzerufei shemot and otiyot v'tevot kedoshot, constantly producing in your mind permutations of the letters to get you to higher states of consciousness. Remember how I began today's session? I was talking about the Maggid teaching about how do you have diveikut, and he said to be like God and God's virtues. And he says, just as God is Rachum v'Chanun, so you should be Rachum v'Chanun. And then the Maggid said, to be Rachum, to be compassionate, is to be aware of the Chomer, of the physicality of the people who are around you. That is a tseruf, that's a recombination. So in other words, if one is, what we're talking about, what he's saying is that he's giving us a glimpse into what contemplative prayer is, right? Contemplative prayer may be an attempt to contract the mind around a single point of awareness. That may be one form of contemplative prayer. But he's saying another form of contemplative prayer is to constantly reconfigure the things that you're thinking about that will constantly push you to a higher level of consciousness. So what I was just describing about the Maggid, that would get you to a higher moral plane, right? To be able to think about the fact that you have to think spirit and matter simultaneously, that the two are intertwined. That helps you see the world from a larger point of view, not just the physicality, not just the abstraction of the spiritual, but the intertwining of the physical and the spiritual, right? So that would be a case where the holy letters are being, in a form of mental prayer, allow you to go to a higher level of consciousness. That, you know, you're taking the letters that you're reading, and they're not simply literal. They are part of this divine energy. So you reconfigure them to get you to a higher spiritual state. And so one attaches, goes up through all these levels, to the worlds, to the levels of the angels. And therefore, it's because you're in this constant state of mental reconfiguration. To be alive, he's saying, as a spiritual person, means you're not stuck in one language form. You're not stuck in one speech act. What you just said of these three letters is something that can be reconfigured to raise your mind to a different plane of awareness. That's part of what contemplative prayer is, right? So he says, because it's impossible, liyot kalul b'ma'amad echad. It's impossible to be stuck in one place. The very nature of being a spiritual person is to be alive, reflective, rethinking the language that you're using, and transforming it. And therefore, he says, the tzaddikim, or the people who are spiritually adroit, spiritually more perfected than we are called mahalchim. That's a term that is often used about the angels and the prophets. They're people who are on the move, right? They're on the road. They're on the move. They're mahalchim. They're not just omdim. They're not just standing. They're mahalchim. They're in this constant state of spiritual effervescence, spiritual energy, spiritual movement. They're called mahalchim. The lo yutzar klal amida zulat betfilah. And you could never think that they are in one stable subject-object relationship in prayer. That God is theistically over against me, right? Because it's all an internal act of contemplative reflection in the sense of this reflexivity, this constant inner change. Dehi hadveikut b'chibor el haborei yitborach. And that is, he says, dveikut, and bonding to the Creator May he be blessed. Right? In other words, look what he's just said, what the Dveikut is. The Dveikut is this constant inner surge of yearning for higher levels of consciousness. That's right. This God-mindedness, where God is not the object. So I'm standing here as a subject of prayer, and God is somehow, as it were, an object of attention. How could God be an object of attention? You say, you can't. You're in this constant state. Every time you have framed it, you've turned God into an idol. So you have to constantly be changing that language, letting that language be dynamic, using the language of tradition to bring you to a higher level that's already embedded in the tradition because the language is there. That very language is now being used as a springboard to other levels of consciousness. Right? You see how he's saying that. And he said, if you are the mahalchim, if you are among the movers, mentally, constantly in this state of engaged consciousness, then with God-minded, right? God-minded, because you can't be moving towards God if you don't have something called God-mindedness. That is the Dveikut. It's not an object that you then put into your eyeball it's a little idol for the brain, right? That God-mindedness, which is the directionality of intention. That directionality of intention, as you're struggling to overcome every formulation, because every formulation itself becomes an idol. It fixes you into being an omaid. And you can't be an omaid, a person who does the amida, who's standing in one place. You have to take that internally and be a mahalech, a person who's struggling to move elsewhere towards God. That process, he says, is the Dveikut. Then he goes on to say something, and I'll just very brief because I want to do another text before we take our break. He says, you can't, even when you're in prayer, you can't pole vault into that level of consciousness. Because you can't say, okay, now I'm opening up my prayer book, I'm going out, the birds are singing, or everybody's gathering, and now immediately I'm going to be there. He said, no. I mean, it doesn't work that way. He said, that's why he's giving a spiritual, I won't go through the whole thing, he's giving you a spiritual reading. Before you get to the Amidah, that standing prayer, which is the moving prayer, right? The religious prayer book then goes through various psalms that are describing the world, right? It describes the nature of the world, right? What's called Pesukei de Zimra, the various psalms of David. And then after the call to prayer, the Baruch Hu, the call to prayer, it shifts to rabbinic language, from biblical language to rabbinic language. But that rabbinic language now is focusing on creation and revelation and redemption, the three major parts of that section of Birchot HaShachar, of the Shacharit. Okay, that takes you up to the Amidah. In other words, what he's saying is you're already been moving through a sense of the vast interconnectedness of the world through the prayers of the Psalms. You're beginning to isolate yourself around theological vectors when you say the Shema, and you talk about God as Yotzer Or, the creativity. When you talk about the revelation that God gives us the Torah, and you talk about the Geula at the end of that. So you're already beginning to vector in to various theological vectors. Then you're ready for the Amidah, and he says, so you're getting through, he says, and there's no hefsek. In other words, you're doing this as an act of continuous consciousness so that you're already been moving. You're already on the go. You're going through the world to other levels if you're praying in a conscious way, and then you get to the Amidas. You're already on the go. And that's why he says, that's why this whole sphere of the divine overflow and emanation from the beginning of the creation, from here down below all the way above, or from its inception from above down below, if you want to think in geographical terms, or from the inside out, however you want to think about it. He said, because now your mind has been put in a state of consciousness where it's now thinking the world as an expression of God, as a gift of God, right? You have begun to realize something of that flow, which is that flow of emanation is called the world of Atzilut. And then he says something amazing. He says, don't read the word Atzilut as simply some external efflux that's flowing into the world. It's because it's slow. That when you've got to this level, it's near you. It's next to you. In other words, you've become connected to it. Otherwise, it's simply an abstract. Here we come back again to it's just an abstract religious term. Atzilut, emanation. That's just an abstract term. What in the world does that mean? He said, but once you've gone through the levels of prayer consciousness, once you've done that with an active mind, we would say, then Atzilut means it's near me. It's part of me. It's etz lo. That is, right? That because now it's becoming part of that devekut. When it's all near me and part of my existential spiritual reality, it's not Atzilut as a phenomenological term of the history of religion. It's etz lo. It's right next. It's part of that person's level of consciousness, and then you see that there's no shehadam omeid etzlo yitbarach mamash. A person really and truly is near God. Now, is that unio mystica? Is that achdut? Is it unity? Is it yichud? Is it a bonding? As we'll see in the text we'll read from this Meshulam Feibush, I'll talk in a second, he says, you got to do it, man, and then you can talk about it. That's what he said. He said, I can talk. He said, the only way you're going to know what I'm talking about is if you experience it. Otherwise, there's nothing for me to tell you about. If you don't experience some of it, then I can tell you where you want to go, but I can tell you what it is. So you have to, that's maybe a little bit more radical than most people would like, but he's simply saying, it's this taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see, right? That's the psalm. So if you go through the end of that text, you'll see that it's struggling with the relationship between consciousness, the machshava, mentality, and then he talks about this aspect of coming in contact with that oscillation of mind, what we would call mindfulness. The mind opens and closes. It struggles to reformulate the language. It says, no, I can't stay here. I have to try to think something more about what it means for me to be alive in this world filled with mysterious forms. And he said, being in that connected place, it's etz lo next to him, is that devekut, right? So you see, it's a definition that's not a definition, right? It leaves it something like a little bit more adverbial than you'd like, but you can't get better than that, he's saying, right? So he's giving he's giving even his spiritual elite a couple of words what to do. Okay, it's so let me. I was thinking I'm going to do all of this text and then another one from Green, but I wanted before we take the break, I wanted to share with you another. But I think you're beginning, hopefully, beginning to see that you can struggle with this, and some here and there things open up. Obviously, you need a teacher to crack the chestnuts, but that's the way it always has been in religious studies. We can't simply go solo. So, so it's a good reason why the notion of discipleship and finding a teacher is necessary. Right? So let us, I wanted to, so the text that I'm going to look at now, it's called Yoshe Divrei Emet. It's by Meshulam Feibush of Shabarish. He was born in 1742. He was very much involved. He visited the Maggid, and he gives us a very radical notion. He's from Galicia. Shabarish is in Galicia, so southern part of Poland. God knows different partitions of Poland, but it's one of those times. So I just wanted to just read a couple of phrases about, just so you get a sense what he's saying. So he, in the preceding one, which was paragraph 11, he was talking about you want to get to the level that there's nothing else. Everything is mitziuto v'kochotav. Everything is God's reality and his the vitality of God's being. How would we translate? He uses mitziut because he has that from Maimonides, but people didn't have any other vocabulary. But as you can see, and this is also what makes studying these sources difficult as well if you're studying them in the Hebrew, every great movement in any religion, and certainly it's true of Judaism, has to create its own vocabulary, right? Because their experience is different. And even if they're using similar terms, they're giving these terms a new valence, right? And so you always are learning a new theological language when you're learning new texts. And that's why sometimes it's more puzzling and difficult. So let me just, so he said, that's where he wants to go. And now let me just try to translate some of this. And all of this notion of realizing that everything is the mitziutav, the kochotav, everything is God's existence and his actuality, right? Or his potentiality, which is actuality. He's playing on the sense of kochotav. Aristotle tries to distinguish that, but here it's punning in a way that actuality and potentiality is the same. So he says, and all of this, to get to that level of consciousness, is impossible if shal havin sheyitabek balev. You can't do that unless you can't get there unless you are in the state of inner divekud, of inner attachment to God. If you are not thinking perpetually of the Creator, may he be blessed, as we have been commanded, that this is the command that you should have God before you at all times, that you should feel God at all times. V'lo yafsik etzlo rega, and you can't take your mind off this for a hair's breadth, right? This was that issue that I talked to you earlier about the Baal Shem Tov, right? Visartem, you take your mind off it. V'avadatem, you're a goner, right? You're thrown back into the pit. So that's what he's saying. It has to be constant. Benimsa, and he says, if a person merits through all this spiritual meditation, dveikut comes to that level of, one comes into some level of awareness, lahakiro. One comes to the level of consciousness in one's pure heart. He's always mixing mentalization and the heart, right? Not just that you think in the heart, but he's linking the two. Not as it would appear when one is simply in this level of imagination. This level of consciousness is not the level of midumeh, of fantasy, that anybody says I can have a kind of image of God. He said it's not. It doesn't work that way. He says this is not what bina is. This is not what God, divine cognition is. But the preparation for this, that you have to perceive this in your inner eye, in one's mind, that this is a true reality. So in other words, we now have a third image, that the inner eye has to open to see a non-image in some level of pure perception, right? Even something that you've never heard or seen from any other person. It's not something that you get through everyday conversation. That you have to do this through seeing in your seichel, in your mind. That was the term also that we just saw before. Shekein hu b'vadai. And one has to come to in oneself. He will then understand in himself, in his etzem, ba'atzmo, through connection and machshavot, now thoughts of one's soul, and the conscious thinking about God at all times, right? But a person who is not in this constant state of consciousness, even though that person may be a believer, he says, even though they are only raising certain levels of fantasy and they're only figments of their own imagination. But only a person who is constantly mindful of God, and that they're dependent on God. I say God is their total reality. Then they are able to see the world in a new way. And you only know that through that particular experience of that. Then he goes on to say, if you merit this, of this level of deveikut, then you think, nachshov, you think of yourself as also ayin, that you have moved to that level of not, right? You've gone beyond what we call differentiation, right? That's why he says you can't use the language of the street, the language of the books, the language of the imagination, because that's the language of everyday articulation. He wants you to, I won't try to tell you what ayin is for the Magid because it's very complex, but the ayin here is a state of not, the nothing, the no thing. It's beyond differentiation. But it's a mental modality, whatever that means, right? Right? It's some awareness of non-differentiated unity. That's just a lot of words, but that's the way people talk about these things. But you only know it by being there or having that. But he's been there, so he's trying to use some terms that make sense and that they appear in the tradition, right? Non-differentiated unity, that all there is Hashem Yitbarach Shemachaye Otam, that all there is God who makes us be, right? So that is the consciousness of non-differentiated unity. So here you see again the paradox, right? You're beyond differentiation, but you're aware of it, right? Right? You can't escape this vicious circle, right? Or you become aware of it maybe after a striking moment of illumination, whatever, right? And then that's why it says in scripture, Atahu Hashem Livadecha. You become aware of two things, he said. That only you are God alone. So now notice, God is the totality, but you come to the awareness of Ata, of the you personified, right? So you have the scripture, so you have that language. And then it says right after Ata Sita, and you've done all these things. So he says, that looks like a problem. Why do you have the duplication of Ata, of you, thou? Because you have to go through two levels of awareness, right? One level of awareness of that first Ata is you God, and only you God alone, right? So he's giving us two levels of consciousness based on that phrase. So that phrase becomes a mantra, right? Atahu Hashem Levadecha. The first level of the breakthrough of consciousness that can maybe be recited after or before the fact is that you are only Levadecha. There's only you, right? So that is one level of awareness. He says the second is Ata Asita, the sense that God is the only agency, right? That even my saying that is God saying my agency, right? Now, obviously, these are paradoxes, and religious language talks in paradoxes. But I think you get what I'm saying, and then he goes on. He quotes actually one more phrase of Dov Ber, and I'll stop with that. He says, so you can say that there are two kinds of people. One person sees the world in terms of its external phenomenological differentiation, he says. And there's another person who is mivinim, who actually see beyond the externality towards the inner. That's the spiritual eye. Okay? And then he goes on and he says, the person who sees the world external, they think that the person with the spiritual eye is nuts. They can't understand it. And the person who does the other can't understand why a person would only see the world in terms of difference and diversity, right? So there are kind of two mentalities that are not in conflict, but they don't understand each other, right? The spiritual seeker and the person who lives in the world just in terms of what strikes the mind and consciousness, right? They both come from God, but there are two modes of spiritual engagement with the divine, right? The first one can also say, I bless God for the fruit, right? So I think I'm having trouble actually remember. I think that there was, so I think the closest thing about the two is there's a very interesting statement in Epictetus, when the Greek ancient Greek philosophy. So there's a difference, he says, between knowing that you take the fruit off the vine, and you look at the fruit, and you say this fruit is part of this mystery of creativity, and you look at it and you examine it, and then you eat it. And then it's inside you. And that's the reality that's inside you. Right? So this is a little bit of what the Maggid is talking about. There's one of the external sight, and then there's something where that same reality has been ingested, and it becomes an interior reality. And you can't say what that fruit is in the same way. It's a totally different language, to the extent that you would even want to use language about it, right? So here we see this kind of great, this enormous vector of attention to the radical immanence that we've been talking about. Obviously there's a great spectrum of people are on the spectrum in different ways. But for the Hasidic world that we've been studying these last 9 weeks, this path of being a mahalich on the path is what they're saying is to be an Oved Hashem, right? To be a servant of God, to be on the path of service, right? That's why they will constantly be saying, well, we've read this passage in the Torah, and we know what it means at this other level, but the Torah is eternal. The Torah is tamidit, right? It's eternal. So what is it having to say about my avodah right now? What is it having to say about my spiritual progress right now? And that's a different level, right? That you could either say it doesn't say anything or it says a lot, right? Depending on what your eye allows itself to see, right? And then he's saying the proof is an experiential proof. That's all. It's not a logical or analytical proof. That's before, but the experience itself is a reality that he's trying to support. So what I think we should first have any questions, and then we'll take a little bit of a break and come back to a text from the Ma'ori Naim. But we have a few minutes for some questions. People want to say something. Tell me about what's going on in your, I see your faces, what's going on in your minds, spirit, ears, face. I wish I knew. Okay, you're not going to tell me. All right. So let me just remind you before we, again, that we meet, I know there are 2 people who are graduating. I hope that the 2 people can show up next week, but I need all papers, all prompt papers and your 1 page. So the 1 page you can give me at that last reading, but all the papers I have to have by that, let's say Monday by after class, okay? So that'll, or we'll fix a time, let us say 8 or 9 o'clock that Monday night, okay? Okay, so I've been warning you, I've been requesting this, so that's not shouldn't be a burden for everybody. All right, anybody, last chance for a quick question? Anybody want to give a quick spiritual word here, or we'll go do physical things? All right, speak to you in a few minutes, okay? Take out, let's meet, it's 10 after, we'll meet in 10 minutes, okay? All righty. So there's Adrian in Georgia. Hi there, Adrian in Georgia. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Okay. So we're going to pick up on Titzaveh. This is the thing of the Ma'ori Naim. We have an expert here. Yitzchak has written his paper on it, so I want you to jump in and help out where you think it's necessary. I think there's some very, I chose this both because it deals with Dveikut, but also it deals with a couple of other issues that we've been talking around for the last weeks. And as you're thinking about writing your papers, I'd like you to come at it from whatever personal or scholarly angle that you'd like. What it's been like to study this material academically or personally, things that have struck you. It should be a chance just to see what's become livable among this, what's become pertinent, okay? So you can share, you can write it at whatever level of personal reflection that you want to reveal. So I bet I'd be happy to receive that. It's helpful, important for me. All right. So this is a portion that in the schema of things, and the scripture comes after the portion about the laws, and then the mishpatim, and then we have the issue of teruma, which is the contributions to the building of the tabernacle, which were often read by the Hasidic sages going back to the Zohar, as the teruma is actually the raising up of consciousness, the raising up of the soul, raising up of God to higher planes. And now we have this portion called Titzaveh, okay, which talks about taking the crushed oil and using those for the lamps, which in most of the standard rabbinic tradition, the katit lama'or is often understood as the issue of martyrological suffering. But obviously in these texts, it'll go in a slightly different direction. So I'm going to, if you have your English or your Hebrew, whatever you want, I'm going to do my translation and commentary as we go through. Okay. And again, try to hear it as a teacher trying to teach through scripture, not just the content of the text, but to try to refocus the mind around key issues for one's spiritual growth. Okay. So he says, so it begins, "V'atatitzaveh b'nei Yisrael," you shall command, or you must, or you will command the people of Israel, "Ve'ikui lecha shemen zayed zach," and they should bring to you, presumably Moses, this crushed oil, which is for the ma'or, for the lights in the temple. So he begins by giving us the biblical text, and now, as is typical in the rabbinic way of studying, he's going to raise a series of questions. It's the way that sort of the early medieval rabbinic commentators called the Tosafot, where they would raise a number of problems, and then they will resolve it. But obviously, the problems now take on, for the Hasidic master, a spiritual resolution, not a halachic resolution. Okay, so this is how he begins. The commentators have really been exercised with a lot of confusions and doubts, sveikot, right? Now there's things that there's a lot of unclarity here, a lot of puzzlements by this text. And I'm going to mention two of them, he says. The first one, why does the text not mention Moses, right? So normally in any commandment, it says the Lord came to Moses saying, right? That's the standard discussion. But here it just sort of pops in and said, you shall command, right? So the you is not directed to Moses, it's a kind of a you to the hearer, right? But that's the first question that, if you're just reading it in terms of the plain sense, you're puzzled. It's different from scriptural style, right? So the issues of style have to be dealt with, but then the problem of style are a way to open up the new spiritual question, okay? I'm going to try to do this so that you can begin to think along with me to see how this process works, okay? It's interesting that he uses hit oreru hamefarshim. They became aroused by that. Normally, that's the kind of a thing to be aroused for a higher level of interpretation. But he's using this as they got all worked up with sveikot. There were doubts, uncertainties, perplexities. So why does it not? The first one is, why isn't the name Moses mentioned? Moshe Rabbeinu, b'mitzvah zo. Right? You would have expected that Moses would be mentioned. It's the only place in Scripture where you don't have the divine voice addressing itself to Moses, or Moses and Aaron, a few places in this particular way. So therefore, that raises the puzzle or the ancillary query, he said, So why is this mitzvah different from all the other mitzvahs in the Torah? There must be something different about it, right? So he's not telling us that we're changing hermeneutical planes. At the first thing, he said there must be, if scripture has given us an odd formulation, it must be telling us that there's something strange or different here. Okay, so he's still at the naive first level of what strikes you when you're reading the text. Okay, because in all other cases it says the Lord spoke to Moses, speak to the people of Israel. Okay, but not in this case. And in this case here, he occluded, and he doesn't mention his name in this mitzvah. Okay, so that's the first thing. He wants to drive this home. So you're already thinking, well, if it just says ata, who is the ata? Who is the you? Right? And what does it mean, command, and so on? Okay, so who is it addressed, and what is it really focusing on? Is it simply another commandment, or is there something else being addressed here? And the second problem, he says, why is the vav, the conjunctive vav, added here? Right? It says ve'ata, right? As if this, what is this following from? What does that conjunctive letter add to our discussion? Right? Why doesn't it just begin, you shall command? Right? God says you shall command. But what is the vav? It clearly doesn't link back to the preceding material. So what is its consecution? What is the way that it's linked, right? So that's the first question. So what is that vav doing? So here we're already getting to this notion that certain letters, not just words, can have ideographic significance, right? They're not, but it's going to be ideographic significance in a spiritual sense. So what is that vav doing, right? What do you think it might mean? And we're going to see what it's going to symbolize once we begin to realize that the Torah and God and Israel are one, right? So what does that vav really symbolize here in the text from his point of view? Even at the plain sense level, it's a puzzle. So why does it say ve'ata titzaveh? What is that and you, or the vav? Does the vav stand alone as a singular thing? So he says, so let's go back to basics, he said. We'll have to begin from the beginning, and I want to give you the spiritual context, he says. He says, let's nakdim me arizal. I'm going to bring back, we have to understand this in its true context. I'm going to tell you that you can't understand all of this, and it's going to include what the vav means and everything like that, unless you understand the opening midrash based on the opening sentence of Genesis. So Genesis says, Bereshit, in the beginning God created. And now, the way this was read in the midrash, Bereshit, Bishvil HaTorah. So the rabbis already in the midrash raised the question, what is the bet of Bereshit? Right? Why didn't it simply begin like Rashi asked? Why doesn't it simply say Reshit? Or like it says in the book of Hosea, Techilat Diber, in the beginning of the speaking. Why didn't it say just Reshit? What is the bet? So that becomes the occasion of the Midrash to talk about various purposes of the divine creation, with this or with that. So one, for example, by quoting from Proverbs 8, it would say, B'chachma, b'Torah. So God created the world with something else, right? So in this case, it's with the Torah, because Torah is considered chachma, right? quoting from Proverbs 8. Ubishvil Yisrael. So those are two about 4 or 5 explanations that are given in Genesis Rabbah. It was for the sake of Torah and for the sake of Israel. So he's going to build on that, because from his point of view, there's no hermeneutical gap between what the sages are saying in the Midrash and what the mystics are saying 2,000 years later. In other words, they're also hiding mystical teachings. And he is going to find that truth already embedded in scripture, embedded in the rabbinic reading. So he says the Torah was created, God created the world with the Torah and for the sake of Israel. So now we already see that there are 3 primal realities that God had in mind. Allah b'machshava, the text says, God, Torah, and Israel, right? And we're going to see that the two come together in a very interesting way. And the inyan, uminyan shekol echad be'echad mi Yisrael. So what is one of the ways that he wants to understand this? Is that each and every person in Israel, so there are 600,000 and a change letters in the Torah, and 600,000, 350 and 3 and change persons at Mount Sinai. Each person has their own letter, and the Torah then it has the souls of all the Israelites, as it were, embedded in each of the letters. So it's also Torah is also an expression of God's teaching, but it also is an expression of the souls of Israel, who are configurations of this language. Okay, so everyone in Israel has the source of their soul in the Torah. Okay, so obviously already we're being brought to another level of reality, that if one studies Torah, one has to find the root of their soul in its meaning, even if one letter. In other words, the connection to Torah is a connection back to God, and each person will read from the structure of their spiritual disposition. That's what the shoresh of the neshama is. The source of the soul is that whenever you're reading a text, and particularly Torah, you're understanding it from the root of your spiritual disposition. You don't just read it neutrally, but everybody brings a certain angle and vector of disposition. And that's where they are particularly anchored, and that without them, the Torah would not be complete, and because they represent one letter and one soul. So every person and their independent vector of interpretation is absolutely essential. So that the Torah is and Scripture is the shoresh of all the shoreshim. So it's the root of all roots, right? So when God creates the world through Torah, he's also creating the structure of souls, the structure of individuality, the structure of independent beings that are also configurations of language and meaning. So these 3 levels go together, right? The creation of world, the structure of readers, and the structure of meaning, which is Torah, which mediates but also contains all of them. So this is the klal of the neshamot of Israel, contains all of them. And by means of the Torah, as by means of the fact that each person has their own soul root in a letter, and that the Torah would be invalid if any soul root was not there. If any interpreter possibility was not there, the Torah would not be a valid Torah. It needs the soul of each person to make it. By means of that, yitachdu nafshot Yisrael b'Hashem yitbarach. Here already we can see we've moved from a theology of primordial Torah of creation to say that because of this, all the souls are united in God. The 8 oskam b'Torah, when they are studying Torah. So now we've taken the hermeneutical level. We're not yet going to the spiritual task, but he's now giving us a fundamental predisposition of the Ma'orinayim and others of that nature, that when God creates the world through the Torah is reflects God's teaching, and the primary articulation of the letters is more than simply letters. They are the soul roots of everyone who are, as we might say, syntactically and semantically bound to one another. Each person, you need the other person to read the world, we might say, right? You need the other letter to create meaning. You need to value the soul root of each person because they are necessary for the meaning of Torah, and they are the Torah, and they are expressing God's reality, who created the Torah. God then needs Israel and Torah. Torah needs God and Israel. Israel needs Torah and God. It's a holy trinity, right? All the three are necessary. The three are fundamentally necessary. For God to be real, there have to be people who acknowledge this through some form of meaning. For Torah to be real, it has to have forms of articulation, etc., and that gives theological expression. So he's already getting at something that the achdut, there's a primal unity, which is this threefold truth. God, Torah, and Israel is from a theological point of view, is a threefold fundamental truth. Not just in the abstract, he says, be'et oskam b'Torah. They become not just an abstract hermeneutical possibility, but they become a spiritual actuality when they are studying Torah. Osek b'Torah is one of the first blessings that a Jew says in the morning. Thank God, the Osek b'Torah, to study Torah. Osek is to be studied, okay? So to be Osek b'Torah is to activate God, activate consciousness, and activate Torah, right? So the human hermeneutical agent is necessary for there to be meaning or theology, right? Without the human agent who chooses to have meaning in this way or think about God in this way, the three become fundamental. It's a hermeneutical integration, and you receive each with each. There are three levels of consciousness. So be'et oskam b'Torah. That doesn't mean that when they're not studying, this triad is not true, but the triad is an achdut. It's a living hermeneutical truth when a person is trying to study and create meaning, because then the Torah becomes a living reality and God's voice becomes a living voice. And one's soul becomes expressive of God's voice. You see how, right? It's daring, but he's transforming Talmud Torah, the study of Torah. It's a spiritual act in which you are connected to God, but not in the way that the Mitnagdim or the Talmudists would have said, right? They too would say that you are in contact with God's tradition and God's voice through study, but here we're getting into a different mystical modality about this, okay? So it's not, this is a shared understanding across the board in the 18th century, but the Hasidim are understanding this from a different sensibility than would be understood, let us say, in the Yeshiva of Volozhin, which could talk about the same language, but still mean something very different, okay? So now he gives us the famous statement. He only gives us, it appears in the Zohar in multiple forms, but he's giving us one of the forms where he says, Oraita v'kudshabrichu chadhu. Torah and God are one. Now, there's another threefold formulation that appears also. It's Oraita kudshabrichu v'Yisrael chadhu. Israel, God, and Torah are one. Okay? So he's quoting the most standard form, but the third one, and that's the three-legged stool that becomes fundamental for the spiritual act of study and finding God, which also means that every time one opens their voice, their soul comes out, but they're experiencing God through God's voice of study, right? It's a very, very, the ritual is a deep mystical ritual. For indeed, that without all this, the world could not have been created, right? God needed Torah and Israel to create the world. And then he goes on to say, by that means, nitached kodshebrichu im Torah, and that God also became bonded and united with Torah, right? So the witness becomes a deep expression. So for the mystical world, the Torah that's revealed is a dimension of divinity that comes to expression at various metaphysical and spiritual levels, and is something that also takes earthly form in our world. So I can see time is going by, so let me move fast a little bit. Now, indeed, he says, God is Ein Sof. So we're already beginning to get something that's a little bit more puzzling. God is the infinite, and God is never nullified. There's no boundary, and there's no limit, and there's no determination or a sense of a distinction with God. So he says, what does it mean that God, and God obviously couldn't have created the world with something physical or limited in time or space, but rather by means of the Torah, God garmented himself, who is light, and he covered himself with this. So he's playing on the passage in Psalm 104 that God wrapped himself in light, oter or kesalma, and that the effusions of emanating light, which is a very old, ancient image, that becomes the light that shines out and creates the world of forms. Okay, so God wraps himself in this light, and this light is Torah, Torah Ora, right? The light is the Torah, and he wraps himself in that, but it's a kind of primordial Torah. It's a Torah that's not of time and space and limit, etc. So that is this primordial light that was God's primary garment. So he's mythicizing and turning into a Torah thing, just a figure of speech that appears in the Psalms. And here we come to our next key notion. By means of this, by means of the fact that God wraps himself in this mystical notion of transcendental light, he says there would be this tzimtzum, there would be this contraction, and things would become delimited in time and space. So in other words, God wraps himself in this primordial light, and through that shining out of light become all the contractions and the forms that become our world. Because he says in the Torah, we already have forms and limits and meaning and a midah and a sense of measure. And then he goes on to say, he refers back to a verse that appears in the book of Zechariah that refers to a flying scroll, and the rabbis have a long elaboration about that, relating that to the Torah, but that the Torah is something that has a midah, has a measure. Right? Supernally, it has no measure, but in this world, it has a measure. But even though it has a measure, the Torah and its letters are a form of tzimtzum, right? What we then, when we read these configurations that we call semantic signs, they're really ultimately configurations of light. And the configurations of light, when they are read as words, become the shining of meaning, of possibilities, where configurations of light are sounded or seen, and they're sounded, and then they produce meaning, right? So, and God creates through those configurations as well. So he says, this is the Torah, which has a measure, and it's the measure that God has given to it. Therefore, the Holy Creator has contracted himself through all the worlds until he created this world in Gvul and Tachlit. All right, so now we're getting a little bit of a hint of this cosmic theology, that in some primordial place, transcending time and space, divinity robed itself in the mystery of light, and light went through all of these various gradations of shade and color and combinations until they became the kinds of fragments of light that could show up on a page or could show up as world. Because remember what I said at the beginning of the hour, from the mystical point of view, this world is what the Maggid would say is Olam Hadibur. It's the world of speech. That is to say, you have configurations of sound and sight that can appear on a page, and you have configurations of light and shade and darkness that appear as the configurations of the world. And they are all read in different kinds of ways. They're all expressions of a divine speech. We don't know how God would articulate that from the point of view of divine speech. We only have it from the point of view of human speech and hermeneutics, right? But nevertheless, we articulate shapes and letters from human language, or all the peoples on the face of the earth are doing different things with those shapes and sounds. And they will also read the shapes and the sounds of the external world in a variety of different ways. And this is part of the tzimtzum of light that can become thicker or more translucent, and it becomes this world. And ultimately, it's a reality of God. That's the tzimtzum. It's a reality of God that has taken a configuration as world, as Israel, and as Torah in our experiential universe. Okay, there's no gap. That the original effulgence through all the worlds is part of this monistic totality, we might say. And in true Neoplatonic fashion, it takes on configuration after configuration of energy patterns, whatever we want to call them. And at some point, these energy configurations take the shape of what we call world, speech, but they also require our reading of them, right? Whatever language you're reading certain configurations, and it's not only one kind of Latin script. There's Greek script, and there's Chinese, and there's every kind of Hebrew. These configurations are multiple. Now, from his point of view, the Hebrew language is the archetypal script, but so all languages come from this primordial language because God created the world in Hebrew from this point of view. But all languages are distinct, and there are different ways of reading the truth, but they are all connected to the creation of the world through Torah, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So there's a much larger metaphysic in spiritual, and that's what we're participating in. Whenever we read and think or look at bodies in certain configurations and read the world, we're participating in a reality that's primordial, that's beyond the worlds of imagination or limitation and space and configuration. But God has given us this for our, so obviously if you study Torah, even willy-nilly, you are brought into this, it's not just an ontic dimension of the ontology. You are a participant in something that's ontological. And then God has measured things out, and he delimited his wisdom, his chachma, so that Yachol ha'olam lisbol or. So this is a typical Maggid expression. So the world could absorb the light. The light was differentiated into configurations that the human eye could perceive, right? Light, shade, balance, whatever, all the binaries and plus things that allow us to have comprehension. Shifat chachmat elukuto yitbarach. So everything is part of this effulgence that comes from a primordial point, and it's all connected. It's all connected, right? And you have to become aware of it. You have to find your place in the letter and the root and the place where your soul is revealed that way. So now he goes on to say, and that's what the Talmud means on the verse, uvo tidbak, that you shall cleave to God. Remember all the text we've been talking about all day and all night tonight. Uvo tidbak. Now he says, so is it possible to cleave to the Shekhinah? Right? Now, what does it mean? So what am I cleaving to? I can't cleave to the trees, not the Shekhinah. What am I cleaving to, he says. But he says you should cleave to midotav. Now we said at the beginning of the class that midotav could be God's moral attributes. But he's not going to go there. So now the midah will be a play on one of the terms of hermeneutical rules, right? So midah can mean three things. Midah can be a moral characteristic. Midah can be a measure of differentiation. And a midah, when God made the midah or the measure of Torah, another word for midah is hamidot shehatorah nidreshet bahen. The midah is the hermeneutical rules by which we read, right? So there is a correlation between the hermeneutical measures of interpretation and the structures of the letters and the configuration of the Torah and the agency of the person who is a hermeneutical agent. So when it says that you are studying with the midot by which the Torah is interpreted, hamidot shehatorah nidreshet bahen, this is the way that you bring your human spiritual measure into conjunction with the measures of Scripture and its meaning, right? There's a kind of homology that we bring ourselves to. That's what he's saying. So he says, the one kind of midot is because God is rachum, you should be rachum, right? But apparently he said this is a surprising thing. And it escapes all kinds of comprehension because God transcends all measure. So how is it possible for us to understand this even in the most literal of ways, of pshuto, right? I sort of jumped the gun, but if it's God is beyond limit, what does it mean to say that you understand God through midah? And what do it mean to say simply it's not just understanding it by means of these moral issues? So what is the pshat, he says? Because it says in the scripture, uvo tidbak. It doesn't say you will just do it through the midot. You have to cleave to God. So now he has the problem. He says, you're cleaving to God in reality. So cleaving to God in reality means to God's midah, which is measured in the Torah, which are his hermeneutical rules. He's now saying something in our hermeneutical language, which is very interesting. He's saying that the very configuration of speech language that we find in Torah has its own inherent hermeneutic of understanding, right? God has, as it were, integrated the possibility of understanding with the content of understanding. by giving us language and forms in a certain configuration, God has also given us inherently the rules and the means for its understanding. And both link us up directly to God, he says. Because it says, Bo Tidbak. So in other words, we must understand this as a unity. So it goes on. However, we must understand this, that the midot have also been contracted and taken on garments, and that God's great splendor is showing up in this way. And these are the 13 midot of the Torah. So now he's doing something very interesting. So I want to just fill this in so you understand I want to unpack all the levels that he's talking about. So now we talked about these midot as moral qualities, but now he wants us to understand that even these moral qualities are God's self in a sense. Why? Because there is Torah and its configuration, but the configuration can be understood through the 13 rules that come down with the Torah from the beginning of how to understand it. Those are the 13 midot, or measures, hermeneutical rules. However, now he brings us back to, you be merciful because I am merciful. Why? Because what does God say in Exodus 34? God says he is God, Rachum v'chanun erechapayim. God reveals God's self, his name, as 13 attributes of mercy. So God creates the Torah, which is God's name, but it's also the 13 attributes of mercy, which is God's name, which is Torah. So the Torah is suffused with the loving kindness of God, God's mercy, those 13 attributes, which is God, which is also the hermeneutical principles of understanding, right? They're layered in a very complex cognitive way. But whenever I study through the hermeneutical rules, I'm coming in contact with God's name, but not God's name as such, God's name as a particular word, which is symbolic of a different virtue of mercy. This is a very Kabbalistic notion, right? So if I say the word Abraham, Abraham is a symbol of chesed, of mercy. So I'm not just doing those letters of Abraham, but I'm also symbolically articulating something that's reflecting God's name through any particular word. And from the 13th century on, there were many books that decode every single word in terms of how they relate to this map of mercy, right? Big stuff, okay? We're just getting a tiny hint of this thing in the 18th century, but this is big stuff that's going on for centuries and centuries, okay? Of how Kabbalists study Torah. So now you get the power of what's going on here, right? If you are osek b'Torah, you are a student of Torah, you are in direct contact with God. But because God's name is Torah, God is the Torah, God is expressive through the words of the Torah, not only the hermeneutical configurations, but also the symbolics of the Torah. And now what? There's identity between God, Torah, and you, because a person who is Israel, right? Right? So you have that same configuration, okay? So you see, he's talking in very condensed terms, but these condensed terms are now symbolic of something. So let me just go a little bit faster here. So this is the Torah, the written Torah that's done, and these are the 13 attributes that are referred to in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7, which is God. What is God's name? Rachum v'chanun, merciful and kind, forbearing, etc., etc. That parses the name, the tetragram, right? That's how he's understanding it. It's parsing the tetragram. And another way of parsing the tetragram, which is the Torah, which is a 13 hermeneutical rules. You see, it's brilliant in its hermeneutical and spiritual complexity. So and all this was hinted at by the sages when they talked about God being merciful. And when a person studies Torah in dveikut, with attachment to God, with attachment of the source of his soul, which is in the Torah, as it says, he makes a connection, a unity, achdur echad, with God, as it were. So the very act of study is a meditative process of actualizing yourself, Torah, and God through the interpretive act, right? So hermeneutics and prayer and study and meditation are vectors that come together, right? They're not separate issues. God is not just out there. He's in there, in you, in the letters, etc., etc. So study is an act of prayer, is an act of actualization of God. Therefore, the pashut, the simple sense of scripture that says uvo tidbak, you'll cleave to God, is bo mamash, actually to God. That's the daring point. Now, what does he mean by mamash actually? And you have to, depends on how sophisticated you are and how you want to read that, okay? So it's not crude. But now you want to say that is an actuality. It's an actuality. It's an ontological, spiritual actuality if you accept the premises of the creation, etc. Right? See, that's why he gave us the premises at the beginning. And he hasn't even talked to us about why it says Vatat Titzaveh. He hasn't given us that yet, right? He's still dealing with what he really wants you to understand about this, the fundamental mystical core of hermeneutics, right? And that God is Yitached b'Makorah, a person unifies himself with his source in the Torah, and therefore he makes a connection with God in actuality. And the sages understood this. How can, that's the way he can have his deveikut with God, mamash. And they explain this puzzling thing by means of God's midot, his interpretive rules by which the Torah is explained. Therefore, through the hermeneutical act of the 13 rules is the meditative, contemplative process of connecting to God. It's not like you're there. That very contemplative act of study is the deveikut. That is the connection with God in which you are involved in that spiritual reality. This is where rubber hits the road, you see, for the Hasidic world, where the spiritual life, the divine life, the study life are not separated and therefore a person who is not able to study Torah in a continuous way, tamid. So remember, he's saying tamid because study Torah is what the Catholics would call a lectio divina. It's this constant articulation of the prayer of God. You're constantly, lectio divina is the lectio divina. It's not just the recitation of a prayer. Lectio divina means you're reciting God, right? It's not just a prayer book. You're reciting God. And so he's saying, and the reason he says tamid, because you have to be in contemplative attachment, tamid. That's why study has to be constant, because that is the meditative act par excellence, right? And if you can't do that, he says, then you should be a person who supports other people who can do it, right? And therefore you find people and help them that they can help you provide that means. So it's a standard way that some of the Hasidic rabbis try to let the community be a part of people's study and their connection to God. Now, we're coming a little bit closer to the rubber hitting the road. Okay. So now he says, it was stated a little bit earlier in the preceding biblical portion of Teruma, that the purpose of Haman, because the portion here is in the Talmud is alluding to the birth of Haman, and who wanted on this month, which is the month of Adar, specifically, and he wanted to kill the Jews, to have the lot that would kill all the Jews. Why? Now, notice how he's going to come closer to his spiritual problem. Because on the 7th of Adar, Moses died, right? So Haman knew the rabbinic tradition that Moses died on the 7th of Adar. So he decides he's going to give this edict of destruction on the 7th of Adar, because if Moses is dead, Moses' merit can't save the Jews. Right? He's off the table, and he's going to be able to go away with that. However, because he says, but he did not know that on the 7th day was also Moses' birthday, right? So Moses never dies. He's simply occluded. So it says that is the time of his histaklut. Now, here is where we make the hermeneutical move, the great hermeneutical move. So he brings in the 7th of Adar. Why? Because traditionally in Jewish liturgy, we read this portion of Tetzaveh right before the festival of Purim. Right? That's the hook, right? That's the connection. It always comes out, and you read this before Purim, and then, which is a week later, and he is, and of course, the issue of talking about Moses is the death date of Moses is a time when people fast and celebrate either finishing the Talmud study or Torah study, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it's a very, various kinds of groups took this on as a special ritual day, okay, of the 7th of Adar. But Haman didn't know this, so he goofed. So let me just go. Now, he says, the histalkut, the occlusion of Moses of dying into heaven, is the occlusion of da'at, of spiritual knowledge. Right? Now, that's his hermeneutical shift. Moses is the archetype of da'at. Moses is the archetype of spiritual consciousness. Moses dying and not knowing where Moses was buried is the hiddenness of the mystery of Torah. He's the archetype of knowledge of God, but the knowledge of Torah. And he becomes symbolic of the fact that there are parts of Torah we don't understand, and there are parts of the Moses da'at, the Moses consciousness, of religious consciousness, that is suppressed and lost in your mind, because you are a Torah too. Right? It's not only lost in the Torah and lost in reality, but insofar as you have been created with the Torah, there's a Moses dimension that can be occluded in your spiritual consciousness. You can forget the Moses divine dimension, which is the deeper dimension, and it's died for you, right? It no longer is alive. It's not accessible. It's not part of consciousness. That's what he's saying. Right? I'm trying to translate this into our language, but that's part of what he's saying. But this dot has occluded from the world, and Moses, no one knows where he died, and he ascended to heaven, which means that this principle of spiritual wisdom has gone back to its spiritual source. We don't know where it is, right? The archetype is lost to consciousness, and it is somewhere else, which means, and it nignas b'Torah. And just as Moses was buried, we don't know where it is, God has hidden this mystery of wisdom of Moses in the Torah. We don't know it's buried. He hid it in the Torah, right? So Moses is Torah, and when Moses dies, he's buried and no one knows where he's buried. But that mystery of true spiritual knowledge was taken by God and hidden in the Torah, which means the Torah contains the mystery of spiritual archetype and consciousness that you have to find. It's not all of it is plain, but it's the deep structure of religious consciousness which is no longer there, right? And people don't know where Moses was buried. So, and each and every person has to study Torah according to their ability to find that hidden wisdom in Torah, which is their own hidden consciousness, right? Because that da'at is, Torah is da'at, it's consciousness. And each person has a Moses archetype, which is their own spiritual search and their own spiritual wisdom, which is their own root in the Torah. But they have to find it, right? They have to find it from the surface level, right? So everybody has to find their soul root in the Torah, their spiritual meaning, their archetype that's been hidden and buried in the Torah, right? Therefore, we don't know where Moses was buried because we don't know where the hidden wisdom is. So now we don't know. So now we're moving closer to the meaning. Are you getting the clue now? It didn't say God spoke to Moses at the beginning of the portion, because this is it's symbolic of the fact that of the hiddenness of the Moses archetype, right? He hasn't said this yet, but can you see now where he's moving? It didn't say God spoke to Moses because Moses is symbolically not there on the 7th of Adar. He dies. He's occluded. He's not there in consciousness. So now he says, so now the mystery of Da'at, how is Moses there? He's symbolically there through that Vav. It says, the Vav is Moses, right? Why? So let me just jump ahead. I think we have only 10 minutes, so let me just jump ahead a little bit. Why? Because if Moses is Da'at, here, tighten your seatbelt, we'll do a little bit of Kabbalah here. So if Moses is Da'at, consciousness, there are two spiritual levels above Moses, right? There is Chachma, wisdom, and Bina, right? There is wisdom, which is the first letter of the divine name. The Yud stands for Chachma. The second letter of the divine name, the He, which is Torah, right, is Bina, which is supernal consciousness. The Vav of the divine, four-letter divine name is Tiferet or Moshe or Torah. And the final He is our Torah or Shekhinah. So the Vav here is symbolic of Moses being the mediating agent between supernal wisdom and the Torah that we have down below. And he represents the Vav, that letter of and in the divine name, which is the connecting bridge between the supernal level and our earthly Torah. But if you don't know where that is, you can't make the connection between hidden spiritual wisdom and earthly wisdom, which is hidden in the Torah, right? So it's the way the Torah comes out. Therefore, it says, that's what it says, Ve'ata titzaveh. Therefore, you will command. So he says, now let me tell you what is mentioned here. That this is that the portion of titzaveh comes out, he says, now on the week that we read on the 7th of Adar. And this is the time that we're talking about the occlusion or the hiddenness of the Moses principle. Therefore, his name is not mentioned at all in this biblical portion of this week because he's hidden. However, he is in occlusion or he's hidden in the Torah through the letter Vav. Through the letter, it doesn't just mean and, it's a symbol, it's an ideogram of that middle letter of the third letter of the divine name, which is symbolic of Torah, which is symbolic of the male principle that comes down to the Shekhinah. Therefore, when the symbolic reading now of Torah is Ve'ata titzaveh, and you shall command. What is this meaning? The vav, that vav, it doesn't mean the vav, ata shehu hadat. The word ata, which is Moses, the vav, which is you, which is da'at, which is spiritual meaning, and which is the flow of the Torah, titzaveh, shall command, which means shall create a tzavta, shall create a bonding or a deveikut with you and the people of Israel, right? So he's saying that the mystery of that sentence is saying that the mystery of wisdom, the mystery of God, the mystery of the occlusion is that is the bonding that we've been talking about, that God, Israel, and Torah are one. That the mystery of that name of Moses. Then he goes on to say, he goes on to say that each person has to find the meaning of the name of Moses. The Torah is called in Moses' name, but we have to find that particular meaning. Now he goes on to say something very interesting, and this links back to what Yitzhak was dealing with in his discussion about the struggle with Torah. So it's referring back to another Talmudic passage that originally Moses instructed Joshua in all the meanings of the Torah. But when Joshua came before the people, according to the Talmud, in the second Talmud in Tamura, he lost his spiritual will and he forgot 300 halachot, and he had 700 doubts. And the people wanted to kill him. You're going to take us into the land? You've got 300 halachot, and you have now 700 doubts? They wanted to kill him. So what does God say? Take them to battle with the Canaanites and get them distracted so they don't have to bother with you. But the way the Ma'or Einayim says that is, if all these things have been lost, take them into the process of struggling for Torah, the battle of Torah. And every person has to find those lost halachot and resolve those doubts. And that is the milchamta shel Torah, the struggle for hermeneutical meaning. In other words, this whole issue that Joshua just lost it, and he became a doubting Thomas, and the people were going to clap him over the head. And God says, look, get them distracted. Let them go fight the Canaanites. But the way the Ma'or Einayim reads this, it says, no, I'm not going to give you the meaning, Joshua. Why? Because the Torah is called after Moses' name. So it has to remain Moses' Torah in what he originally knew, but which is hidden. Therefore, galvanize the people, and the study of Torah is the recovery of their Moses in each person and the recovery of the teaching of Moses, which had been lost. So there's a very daring thing here, right? There's a deep mystery of the lost Moses in each person's consciousness, and there's a deep loss of the original meaning of the Torah that God told to Moses. And now the struggle for Torah, which we saw is a personal meditative act, is restoring the Torah to its original truth, to its original reality. God needs Israel, Israel needs the Torah, and Israel needs this meditative act of study. They all come together. And he said, so that is, and he says that's why they have to go, yochlu lavo la'atzmam. We'll conclude with this. They're not going to simply find it by lifting up It's like the Torah is not a series of like sewer covers, and you look in and you can find what's hidden in there, right? That's not what the words are. He says you have to open up yourself. You have to look inside yourself because you have a Moses principle hidden inside you, which is your hermeneutical core. And you have to find that Moses principle hidden in the text, which now requires everybody of the community to recover the hermeneutical sense of Scripture. Hence, the opening sentence is a directive. Take the hidden Moses, that Vav, you, each one of you, take the hidden Moses that is in you and bind yourself to the Torah to recover its hidden sense. And that is the meditative act that's required of each person. And it restores God's voice to God. It restores reality to itself. And it restores you to being one of the letters of the Torah. Right? The history of the spiritual search is the search to help God become God. And it's the spiritual search that helps the self find their true spiritual essence, which has been lost because the Moses principle has been lost inside you as well. And that can only be recovered through this spiritual act of hermeneutical recovery. Right? I think this is amazing text, even for all of its foreignness, you can see that things that we care about of hermeneutics as a spiritual act of recovery is all there in its own ritual world, but it's as a spiritual and ethical and a lack of how learning is a process of anamnesis, of recovery, of lost memory, right? And you do it through your own spiritual recovery of yourself. You have to become your own analyzan, right? You have to recover it by looking ba'atzma. Each person has to go through their own way. And in that recovery is the mystery that God is not only the 13 levels of interpretation, but God is the 13 levels of mercy, which means, and this is the way it will end, as you interpret, you have to love yourself as well, or you'll misinterpret. All right. I think this is a lot of stuff. So brood upon this. I charge you to brood thee on. And next week we will meet. Give me a page, maybe a page of brooding. It doesn't have to be, but brood thyself forward as a spiritual act. Okay. And next week I want to hear people's voices. I love looking at your faces, but I want to hear your voices and hear that Moses principle come out, okay? So let's hope for better times all around, that people can find that charity that's necessary to heal as we go forward into this very difficult week of human isolation and the difference of peoples and misunderstandings. And let's hope we can come together next week with more healing and more understanding. So I wish you well, and we'll see you all next week. Take care.
Thank
Bye,
you.
Professor.
Bye. Bye.
Yeah.
Good.